All right. So today I would like you to take out a piece of paper for your notes first, because I think this will be helpful for you. So I'd like you to take out a piece of paper before we start our example problems. And first of all, I want to talk about chapter 10 is about comparing proportions and comparing means. What makes chapter 10 different is that we're going to be talking about two samples instead of one. So we might be comparing males to females, or people who like incomes for college graduates versus non-college graduates. Chapter 10 is actually going to combine everything we learned from chapters 7, 8, and 9. So just to remind you, in chapter 7, we learned all about sampling distributions. In chapter 8, we learned about constructing confidence intervals. In chapter 9, we learned how to run significance tests, also known as hypothesis testing. For all three of these chapters, 7, 8, and 9, we learned to do this for one proportion and then for one mean. And our chapters always went like learn about sampling distributions, and then we learned about proportions, and then we learned about means. For confidence intervals, it was like, what is a confidence interval? Then we constructed confidence intervals with proportions, confidence intervals with means. In chapter 9, we learned about what is a significance test, how do we write those hypotheses, and then we learned about how to run tests for proportions and then for means. So chapter 10 is set up the same way, except for we're going to be doing both of these things. We're going to be constructing intervals, and we're going to be running significance tests. And we're interested in comparing proportions, so two proportions, and then comparing means, two means. So our notes today, we're going to talk about confidence intervals comparing proportions. So first of all, I want you to remember in 7, 8, and 9, we had three conditions: random, independence, and normality. Those conditions are going to be the same. And today we're talking about proportions, but two proportions. So when we're talking about random, I'm talking about either a random sample or random assignment in an experiment. And so that will be either stated or it isn't. This is the only condition. If they don't state it, we go ahead anyway and just say like proceed with caution. But we can't make inferences about the population if we do not have a random sample, and you can't make inferences about causation unless you have a random assignment in an experiment. Our second one is independence. Oh, I forgot. So, but you have to do this for both samples. So our conditions are the same. The only difference is that we're going to do them all twice, right? Because there are two samples. So for independence, that's our 10% rule. We do that so that we can calculate standard deviation. That's the whole point of our independence rule. So we're going to go 10 times n must be less than or equal to the population. But here's the thing. We have two samples, so we have to check that twice. We have to do it for sample 1, and we have to do it for sample 2. For normality, we do normality so that we can find critical values when conducting confidence intervals. And actually, we use a normal curve to calculate probabilities. That's how we get our p-values in our significance test. So we have to check our normality condition. Now, our normality condition for proportions is large counts. So recall that our large counts condition requires at least 10 successes. NP has to be greater than or equal to 10, and it requires at least 10 failures. 1 minus P has to be greater than or equal to 10. But again, I have two samples, so I have to do it twice. I have a sample 1 and a P1, a sample 1 and a P1, and I have to do it also for my second sample N2, P2, and my sample size 2. So again, these are the same as we've been doing in chapter 7, 8, and 9. The only difference is we have to do it for both samples. Okay, So now reminding you about all the calculator functions we've used so far. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and list them all, not just for proportions. I'm going to kind of put them all here in one place. So this will be really nice to have written down. Calculator functions. Now remember, to get to these calculator functions, you're going to go in your calculator, you're going to go stat, and you're going to scroll over to test. So back in chapter 8 for confidence intervals. So in chapter 8, which was confidence intervals, which is what we're doing first today as well, actually, confidence intervals, you had two different functions. If it was about a proportion, you used in your calculator, it was way down. It's way, way, way down here. And it was a 1 proportion z interval. And remember the things they asked you for, your x over n, because your p hat is just number of successes over your sample size. And it asks you for your confidence level. So for proportions, you would scroll down to A to get to 1 proportion z interval. For means, just to remind you, so for means, you did a t interval was number 8, a t interval. And you could either give it data or stats. So for means, you went down to number 8 and you used a t interval. In chapter 9, for significance test, if it was a proportion, you went to a 1 proportion z test. Number 5, a 1 proportion z test. You probably see where this is going. This was number 5. For mean, we used a t test. It was number 2. In chapter 10, we are interested in both confidence intervals and significance test. If you want 2 proportions or 2 means. And for our significance test, you're either going to have 2 proportions or 2 means. So notice right above so where you have t-test, you also have a 2 sample t-test. So that would be remember, t-test are for means. So for means, you're going to go 2 sample t-test, which is number 4. For proportions, I'm just writing the test down first because they just come first numerically. For your proportions, you have a 1 proportion z-test. That's what we use in chapter 9. The only difference is we're looking at 2 different samples. So it'll be a 2 proportion z-test, which is number 6. For our confidence intervals, we are just choosing, remember, our means, I'm at the means here. So the means was a t interval. So number 9 is a 2 sample. Actually, we don't want a z interval, though. We want a 2 sample t interval. So that's like a 0. For our proportions, remember we were way down on A, but for 2 proportions, it's just right underneath that, it's B. 2 proportion z interval. So here are all your calculator functions in one place. So that's going to be really good for you to have later. All right, and let us do some of our practice problems, shall we?